Interesting.
You hear him talk.
Hear who talk?
My dad.
Your dad. Well, I do have his recordings.
Do you?
Yeah.
Oh, I'd like to hear him.
And so we're gonna play them in a second. But first of all, let's see if we can remember about him. His name was Stuart Hannon,
Yes.
right? And he moved you to Germany in 1945. For what purpose? Why did he move you to Germany?
Well, he was with the State Department.
He was with the State Department. He was a diplomat for the State Department. And he also worked for Radio
For Europe.
For Europe, yeah. And so he was an expert on the threat of the what country?
The Russians.
Of the Russians, the Soviet Russians. And he would give talks on things about the Russians. Well, you lived in Germany for 5 years, from 1945 to 50. And then from 50 to 51, you moved to
California.
to Switzerland.
Yeah.
And where did you live? In Bern. Where else did you live? Bern and
Well, we lived in a town called Vorb.
Vorb. Okay, so you lived there for a year, and then you came back to Berkeley in 1952.
We lived in a castle.
You lived in a castle in Switzerland, and your dad wrote something called "A Castle Is Not a Home." And then you came back to Berkeley in 1952, 53. You lived on
139
Parkside Drive. And you delivered a certain newspaper.
The Oakland Tribune?
You delivered the Oakland Tribune.
Yeah.
And so then you went eventually to Connecticut, I think in 1955 or so. And you graduated from high school in 1958 in Danbury High School. And then you went off to University of Connecticut. And so when you were at University of Connecticut and you were 20 years old, which was 1960, the very same year that Kennedy defeated Nixon in that election of 1960, your dad was over in San Francisco giving a talk at a place called the Commonwealth Club when you were 20 years old.
Yeah.
And so those tapes from the Commonwealth Club just got uploaded onto the internet, and we are now able to listen to your dad's talk in 1960.
Oh, let's listen.
Okay, let's listen. So we just go over here and hit play.
Assistant to the Director of Radio Free Europe, who spoke before the weekly general meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California here in the Sheraton Palace Hotel in San Francisco on the topic, the new Soviet offensive. Mr. Hannon, you used the word new in your title, I notice, but in your opening remarks, did you suggest that there's something eccentric or decadent about a system in which, after people have been threatened, kidnapped, beaten, and brainwashed, shot from the skies repeatedly, stopped in the high seas and denigrated before the world with shocking lies and insults year after year, that we in the United States still say to each other and in our newspapers and radio and television, this is most strange, unprecedented, and what does it all mean? How do you explain that, Stuart Hannon?
Well, I think it's very difficult to explain without taking into consideration our long and rather remarkable history. After all, we have grown up, we have tried to practice and improve our democracy for more than 160 years, and we have, with our Puritanic background, with our belief in giving the other fellow a chance, with believing that one man or one system is just as good as another, that if people will just sit down at a table, they can solve all their problems. There's nothing, I think, essentially dedicated to power for the sake of power or evil for the sake of evil in our system. And therefore, it's almost inconceivable for many Americans to think of a system or to understand a system like the Soviet communist conspiracy and to realize what it is really after, what it is predicated upon, and the methods it employs in order to achieve its ends.
But Stuart,
we are always ready with wishfulness, hopefulness. No matter how many times we are clobbered, we believe that perhaps this time Mr. Khrushchev or Mr. Stalin or Mr. Mikoyan or someone else really means what he says. And after all, as was said about Mikoyan's trip here, the man seems to make sense. My point there is that who would expect the number 2 man of the Soviet Union to travel across the ocean to visit a country marked for eventual Soviet and communist conquest, who would come here to make nonsense? These are skillful, tough, cynical, callous, ruthless crusaders for their system.
Ruthless.
But, Stuart, we find here in the United States so many people, I could lead you to hundreds of them, literally, who'll say, oh, well, communism is some in Russia, some in China, of course, and there's some down perhaps in the waterfront here and there, but will ridicule and attack and sneer at any individual that suggests that possibly in their parent-teachers association, in their lodge, in their blue plate luncheon club, or wherever it may be, that they actually would be rubbing elbows or talking with an honest, actual member of the Communist Party. They ridicule it. How come that way? Are we brainwashed, or what's happened to us?
Well, I would go so far as to say that there has been a certain amount of brainwashing. You don't have to sit in a dark room or in a light room under 5,000 watts of lights day after day in order to be brainwashed. Soviet communism has, with great help from the Western world, done some remarkable brainwashing. After all, as I have pointed out, and as I think all of us know, we have turned over our radio and TV facilities to visiting firemen from the Soviet Union. The only trouble is they bring the fire; they don't put it out. We've had cultural exchanges. We've had agricultural experts and so-called people. I wouldn't go so far as Congressman Judd, perhaps, as to say that all these people are agents. But I've met some pretty grim-looking students traveling around this country.
The Nazis did the same thing, didn't they? The Nazis sent over technicians to teach the use of tractors in Latin America and Africa.
One of the oldest techniques, which go way back to the Egyptian world, one of the oldest techniques of aggression, of political aggression and eventual military conquest is cultural exchange.
That was what the Greeks were doing when that horse was left.
It comes in different terms.
Trojan horse?
It may be exchanged in the term of a gift. Remember the famous phrase, beware the Greeks, for their hands offer gifts. There are many forms of this. The idea is simply there are many ways to destroy your enemy besides attacking him front on, the frontal assault with weapons.
Stuart Hannon, there were many phrases used today that reminded me of the late Elbert Hubbard's expression referring to certain words that he said, cast a purple shadow. And one of your phrases today, which I'm not going to forget, was that you said, we need policies which are not limp, with caution and conservatism. What do you have in mind there?
Well, I think I mentioned that I was quoting that's not my phrase, I was quoting one of the candidates for office, for the presidential office, and I think what he meant, and certainly what I meant, was exactly what the phrase says. You cannot compete with a ruthless system like Soviet communism if your policies are conservative, compromising, retiring, taking into maximum considerations all of the problems of a democracy, as if we were living in normal times, as if we had a democracy which was not under siege by a system which would like to destroy it. You cannot come into conferences with petty dictators and arch criminals and pretend that there's a moral equation at work. These are mistakes that we make constantly. You can't parrot legitimate principles, things that we have come to accept as examples of law and order, if the other party, if the antagonist, dismisses them as archaic notions of a decadent civilization. And you know from everything he says that he is out to destroy that civilization.
You said, Mr. Hannon, that in a talk down at Stanford, that we are in a suspended war status with the Soviet Union and should face that fact. And then you quoted Nasser of Egypt on that same line, didn't you?
Yes, that's correct.
What did you mean
yes,
by that?
My point there was that I had felt long ago that we were in a state of war, which is called peace. It's like a 1984 terminology of George Orwell. We are in a state of war, and I remarked it because I had learned only the other day from an American congressman that Nasser of Egypt had said to him, way back in 1955, the only trouble with you Americans is that you don't realize that you have been in World War III since the end of World War II.
We know that the psychologists, Stuart Hannon, and some of them at least, the Freudian school, tend to teach that the tensions are the trouble with us, and a lot of us believe that if we only get rid of tension, everything's going to be hotsy-totsy. Perhaps a little bit like saying because an automobile engine gets hot and vibrates and makes some noise, that therefore we should stop the engine and all would be well, because we have a doctrine, I believe now, of many psychologists, that tension is necessary and essential to drive us on to achievement and work. Now, this tension in the world, we are taught universally almost that what we should avoid is any tension. Can we do that and still work in our own interests in all cases?
No, I don't see how we can avoid tension, and I think the last thing in the world we should do is to try to accommodate the Soviet Union or communism in relaxing what they describe as tensions. There are exceptions, of course, but by and large, all of those things which they castigate as tensions or warmongering are things which actually are part of our defense pattern. Merely because Khrushchev or Polyansky or Mikoyan or Menshikov are these people who float around the country making speeches or are constantly on radio and TV in other countries, merely because they would like to stampede us to a peace or to universal disarmament or to the various word concepts they use in order to undercut the very stuff and security of democracy. There's no reason for doing it.
I think
and we can only understand these things if we can get to understand or take the time to understand communist dialectic. We must realize that they are speaking a slightly different language than we are.
Stuart, will you please...
And it's a basic job of education.
Will you please define that term dialectic, because you're an expert in the field, and a lot of us have a vague idea just how to define. We hear communist dialectic referred to all the time. What is it?
Well, it's difficult because volumes have been written on it, but dialectic is in essence, their interpretation of, let's say, of historical development, of philosophical terminology, which, for the most part, is quite opposite to our interpretation of words. The euphemistic expression for certain things, for instance, you hear the constant phrase, the People's Republic of Czechoslovakia, the People's Democratic Republic of Poland, etc. You hear about the Labor Unity Party of Poland. It has nothing to do with the Labor Unity Party of Poland, it's the Communist Party of Poland. They force us, through their own terminology, to use words, for instance, such as government, when actually the word we should be using would be regime or oligarchy or something. Words, nomenclature, are very important in fighting this battle.
To make a very rough and ready definition, it means that they use words to mean what they don't.
Words which they do not mean, yes.
Yes.
It's the best example of this, I think, is that remarkable and terrifying book written many years ago by George Orwell. Peace is war, slavery is freedom, etc.
Well, now, tell me, with the constant condition that you and I were talking about a minute ago before we went on the air, Stuart, that our papers are constantly saying the United Nations is puzzled by Russian move. President is enraged by what Khrushchev said. State Department shocked or unprepared for this. We've been reading that year after year after year. And one of your lines was a quotation from Marx, I believe, in which he said that successful Russian diplomacy had long rested on the timidity of Western statesmen.
Yes, that's very true. I think it was true then, and I think it's true now. The Hungarian patriot Kossuth wrote a whole book on that subject and gave many excerpts from it in 1852 when he visited the United States to try to explain to the American people, as he tried to explain to the English people, what Russian diplomacy, or today's Soviet diplomacy, is like, how it operates, how it is a subterranean operation, an underground, long before we ever heard of the term the Soviet system. These are the things that simply must be more clearly understood. And I think it's a job of the American press, not only the government, but the American press, organizations like civic clubs, foreign policy associations, foreign counselor groups, to explain this, to get in touch with the people in every area on a kind of Minuteman system, so that we know what we're doing, at least we can find out where we have been and know better where we're going.
I understand that all Russian diplomats are required to be more or less expert in playing chess, and certainly in the mental field they've shown agility there. We think we're clever if we play checkers. They can move 3, 4,